Hello and welcome to Mental Melon podcast. This time we will be with Dr. Ernesto Guzman, the bee breeder of University of Guelph. Dr. Guzman, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, I'm Ernesto Guzman, director of the Honeybee Research Center and professor here at the University of Guelph. I teach apiculture, bee biology, and pollinator biology.
Excellent.
I also conduct research on different topics of honeybee breeding, genetics, behavior, and diseases.
Excellent. So let's get started with the questions. So you've noticed that different vigorous grooming techniques could reduce the amount of varroa mites. Could you explain which strains you found were the most groom heavy?
Talking about grooming behavior?
Yeah, you mentioned that varroa mites could be removed extensively by grooming by the worker bees. So could you explain which strains are the most?
Yeah, well, grooming behavior, it's a behavior that it's expressed in all bee strains, honeybee strains. To begin with, there are over 20,000 bee species, but the Western honeybee that we produce honey with in Canada and in all countries in the Americas, it's Apis mellifera. Apis mellifera, it's a bee that it's affected by more than 20 different diseases and pests, one of which is the varroa mite, varroa destructor, which is a parasite the size of a pinhead. It's like a little tick that feeds upon the blood and fat tissue of this. This parasite is relatively new, the Western honeybee Apis mellifera. The first report of this mite affecting Apis mellifera come from the 1950s or late 1950s. And you say, well, that's a lot of time, 70 years. Yeah, for human terms, it's a lot of time, but not for evolutionary time. It's a relatively short length association between this parasite and Apis mellifera because the original host of varroa mites are the Asiatic bees, Apis cerana. With them, they have been associated for thousands of years, and those bees have developed mechanisms of resistance that also are present in our Western honeybee Apis mellifera, but at a lesser degree. So one of them is grooming behavior, one of those mechanisms of resistance against the varroa mite. And while most strains of bees would express grooming behavior, not all bees within a colony would express the behavior. Just to give you a numerical, hypothetical example. Let's suppose you have a colony of 10,000 bees and only 500 of those 10,000 bees express grooming behavior. That is, they try to use their legs and mandibles to remove mites from their bodies. But you have another colony of also 10,000 bees, and in that second colony, out of 10,000 bees, 5,000 bees express grooming behavior. Obviously, the second colony would be more resistant or tolerant to the mites because they would be more able to remove more mites from their bodies by grooming behavior. There are some strains of bees or genotypes, we call them, that are more prone to express grooming behavior. For example, the so-called killer bees or Africanized bees that originated in South America, in Brazil, and spread to most of the American countries there in southern United States. Those bees, which are more aggressive than our European stocks, tend to be better groomers than the European bees, so they're more resistant to the mite. There is a strain of bee that was imported to the United States initially from Eastern Russia, the Primorsky Russian bees, and then later to Canada, and they're reared here by a couple of breeders. Those bees are better groomers than most strains that beekeepers work with here in Canada. So there you have two examples of strains of bees that express this behavior at a higher rate than the average European races of honeybees we work with in Canada. So this is an important mechanism of resistance against the mite, but there are others, like hygienic behavior. Hygienic behavior is the ability of the bees to detect cells that have been capped with a wax capping and contain pupae of bees that are parasitized with the mite. They are able to detect through the wax capping that there is a mite inside the cell. They remove the wax capping and they remove the pupa, and with that they interrupt the life cycle of the mite. So that's another mechanism of resistance against the mite. Grooming behavior, hygienic behavior.
Are there specific strains that are also really good for grooming behavior as well?
There are some strains that are better at expressing hygienic behavior, and some of them have been bred artificially. In Minnesota, Dr. Marla Spivak bred a particular line of bee that expresses hygienic behavior. There are other bees, other strains of bees that have been developed at the US Department of Agriculture lab in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that express as a specialized type of hygienic behavior. They detect cells in which there is a mite, but that mite is in a reproductive phase. When the mites are reproducing, those bees detect those mites reproducing, they open the cell, remove the pupa, and with that, they interrupt the breeding cycle of the mite. And with that, they keep mite populations at low levels.
So since you mentioned that killer bees are really good at removing the mites through grooming, are the traits for grooming associated with high aggressive traits?
Could you repeat that last part?
Are the traits for really good grooming associated with the traits for really large aggressive behavior?
For hygienic behavior?
For aggressive behavior with people, I mean.
What's rested behavior?
Are the traits for grooming associated with the traits for aggressive behavior?
Okay.
With our people?
We don't call it aggressive, you see. We call it defensive.
Sorry.
Behavior.
I apologize.
Because aggressive implies that the bee is looking for a victim. Bees are not looking for victims. Even the so-called killer or Africanized bees, they're not flying out trying to find victims to sting. They defend their nest most vigorously than the European bee. And that only happens when a person gets close by their nest, knowing it or not knowing it. Sometimes people get close to natural nests of Africanized bees and they don't know they're close to a nest and they are stung. But because the bees are defending their um, area near the nest, so they feel threatened. So that's the only time they would unchain an attack to intruders. So is there a link between defensive behavior and grooming behavior? Could be. We're not sure yet. We have some data that showed a correlation, a relationship between grooming behavior and defensive behavior. The bees that groom better showed higher levels of response to an alarm pheromone. However, responding to an alarm pheromone, it's different to stinging. So I guess the most accurate answer to your question right now is we still don't know. We need to conduct more research to find if this association between grooming and response to alarm pheromone also translate to a relationship between grooming and stinging. And there's, of course, more research to do to find out the answer.
All right, since you've done some breeding research, how heritable are these grooming and defensive behavior traits when you crossbreed, say, a non-defensive strain with a defensive strain, or a low defensive strain with a very defensive strain, or something like that?
We don't do that in Canada, but I did that many years ago in Mexico, working with Africanized bees. So we used a technique that is called instrumental insemination. And what we did is we obtained the semen of Africanized drones, the defensive strain. And with that semen, we inseminated virgin queens of a European race to produce a hybrid colony. And that hybrid colony was as defensive as the Africanized colonies. So that was telling us there was some sort of dominance there. But when we crossed the made crosses the other way around, that is, we used an Africanized queen and inseminated that queen with the semen of European drones, the colony was intermediate. So what that was telling us is that the defensive behavior of colonies was mostly inherited from the father rather than from the mother.
So with these intermediary ones, are they more suitable for beekeeping than, say, killer bees, so to speak?
Yes, they are better, but not ideal. So we estimated that a 25% max level of Africanization is acceptable. So we would need to do an extra cross to have manageable bees and productive bees at the same time. And many beekeepers are doing that in Latin America and Southern United States. So they're keeping bees that can be managed and can be still productive. But keeping highly Africanized bees is not desirable.
All right, onto viruses. I do know that varroa mites sometimes carry different viruses. I've heard of an Israeli strain a varroa mite that actually carries a type of virus. So any of your strains resistant to different types of viruses?
The mites can vector and transmit viruses, several of them. They can transmit the Israeli paralysis virus, Israeli acute paralysis virus, the Kashmir bee virus, and above all, the deformed wing virus. The deformed wing virus is called like that because when bees become infected with the virus and they emerge from cells, they have damaged wings. So that's a virus that shows the symptoms. And that's why it's called deformed wing virus. And it's vector and transmitted by the varroa mite. They can actually multiply these viruses, the deformed wing virus, in the salivary glands of mites. So when the mites bite a bee or bite a pupa, they inoculate a high level of lots of viruses into the honeybee blood that we call hemolymph. And then as the bee develops inside the cell, its wings get affected. So when she emerges wingless or with crumpled wings, and she cannot fly. She cannot fly, she cannot be productive for the colony because obviously won't be able to visit flowers. So this mite is very damaging to the bee. Not only it feeds upon the blood and fat tissue of the bee, debilitating it, but it also transmits these deadly viruses.
Excellent. One more question. So in one of your papers on the relationship between Fluffyendin, I think it's how it's pronounced,
What?
and that Neonicotinoids.
Neonicotinoids, you mean?
Yeah, sorry about that. I bad pronouncing these things. But you mentioned in one of your papers that the neonics prevent to a certain degree the bees from perceiving different problems, reducing their self-grooming behavior. Do you know which neurons are being attacked specifically?
We don't know. We know that neonicotinoids are nerve poisons. They affect the neural system of bees, central nervous system, and even at very low doses, sublethal doses, they cause damage in the long term. For example, we found that exposure at the larval stage to very low levels of neonicotinoids when fed pollen that contains the neonicotinoid. When those bees emerge and become adults, they live shorter lives and they tend to perform fewer foraging trips to the flowers. So they contribute less to the colony. Because one of the arguments made by those who think that neonicotinoids are not dangerous to bees is that the levels of these chemicals in pollen or nectar of flowers is so low that they couldn't damage the bee. But we have demonstrated that those levels found in nectar or pollen could be causing some chronic toxicity to the bee that affects their length of life and their behavior. And obviously, if you have them at higher levels, sure, you will see effects almost immediately in a matter of hours, but that's not what they find in the field. What they find in the field are sublethal doses, but they're still damaging to the bees.
All right, I think that covers everything for the interview. But before we end this thing off, do you have anything you want to say to the audience?
No, I don't know what else to say. Hope some of this information provided is useful or informs people more than anything else.
Well, thank you for being here.
Yeah, you're welcome.
I'm just going to stop